My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I am 72 years old, a retired literature teacher, and a Black woman who has lived in Oregon my entire life. For decades, I believed my duty was to give, to support, to sacrifice. I worked late nights correcting papers by dim light. I took extra tutoring jobs so my daughter could study without debt. I believed that love was measured in hours and dollars. But 1 week before her birthday, the world I built for her shattered with 6 words. She looked straight into my eyes and said, "The greatest gift would be if you just died." The words struck harder than any slap. My hands trembled around the white box that carried a birthday cake worth $200. It was a cake decorated with blue frosting roses, her favorite as a child. I had ordered it 3 weeks earlier, believing I could make her smile. Instead, I felt my chest tighten, as if oxygen had been stripped from the room. I stood there frozen while her husband Evan cleared his throat and looked away, pretending not to hear. The laughter of my 2 grandchildren drifted faintly from upstairs, innocent voices unaware of the cruelty that had just been unleashed below. Melissa, my only daughter, smirked, adjusted her silk blouse, and turned toward her glass of wine, as if she had simply made a witty remark. At that moment, I understood. The years of financial help, the mortgage payments, the down payments, the tuition, the wedding costs. It had all become invisible, swallowed into an abyss of entitlement. I whispered, barely audible, "Happy birthday, Melissa." I set the cake on the counter. The candles remained unlit. Then I walked out into the Oregon rain, feeling every drop sting my face like small betrayals. That night, lying awake in my modest rented apartment, the words echoed. I could not erase them. "If you just died." They circled my mind louder than the storm outside. I stared at the ceiling and asked myself, was my love nothing more than a burden to her? I thought of the $20,000 joint account that I maintained for her emergencies. I thought of the $460,000 house, whose mortgage I had guaranteed, sacrificing my own retirement comfort to keep her family stable. I thought of the receipts, years of them neatly folded in a wooden box I kept hidden in my closet. I realized something painful but liberating. I had trained my daughter to believe my love was limitless and unconditional, but I had also trained her to believe my resources were endless. She mistook sacrifice for obligation. And so as the rain hammered my window, I decided to grant her wish not by dying, but by disappearing from her financial world. The next morning, I drove to the downtown branch of the bank. The parking lot glistened with puddles. I wore my old gray coat, the one my late husband used to say made me look like a judge. Perhaps that was fitting. At the teller's desk, I asked to close the joint account. The young banker raised his eyebrows when I signed the form, but he said nothing. His polite smile carried a flicker of surprise, maybe even quiet respect. When he handed me the confirmation slip, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in decades, my hands were free. I folded the slip carefully and placed it into my purse. I thought of Melissa's birthday dinner scheduled for the following week. I imagined her opening the envelope. I would leave behind an envelope heavier than any gift, filled with numbers and truth. Because what I left on her table would not be flowers or jewelry. It would be the account closures, the canceled funding, the irrevocable changes to my will. And those papers, more than my death, would break her completely. Yet even as I walked back to my car, doubts gnawed at me. Was I being cruel? Was I betraying my own blood? The moral conflict burned inside me. On one hand, a mother should endure. That is what society says. We endure insults, we endure exhaustion, we endure thanklessness. On the other hand, there comes a point when endurance becomes erasure. If I continued, there would be nothing left of Eleanor Whitmore, only a hollow account that others withdrew from until it ran dry. I gripped the steering wheel and asked myself, do I want to die as a human being, or live as a woman who finally chose herself? The answer came in the silence of that car. I wanted to live. That night, I opened the wooden box from my closet. Receipts spilled out like confessions. $42,000 for tuition, $35,000 for the wedding, $150,000 for the down payment, $16,000 per year in mortgage coverage. The numbers blurred through my tears. I placed each paper flat on the dining table. One by one, they covered the surface until it resembled a ledger of a lifetime. I whispered to myself, this is the price of motherhood in America. And then I did something radical. I started writing. With my fountain pen, I began a letter, page after page, 23 in total. I wrote down every sacrifice, every dollar, every sleepless night. But I also wrote the truth that love is not measured by what we give away until we are empty. That boundaries are not betrayal. That respect cannot be bought. When I finished, my hand ached, but my spirit felt lighter. I slid the letter into an envelope. On the front, I wrote simply, "To Melissa from Mom." That was the night I transformed from victim to author of my own story. I did not know then that Melissa would retaliate with venom, accusing me of dementia to seize back what I had taken away. I did not know that a courtroom would one day echo with our names. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity: my daughter had wished for my death. Instead, I had chosen my life. And in choosing life, I had already set in motion a quiet revenge that no storm could erase. I did not sleep much that night. The sound of rain outside was relentless, like a metronome marking the passage of every sleepless hour. By morning, my body felt heavy, but my mind was restless. I walked to the closet and pulled out the wooden box that had been hiding in the shadows for decades. Inside were the receipt statements and contracts, silent witnesses to a lifetime of sacrifice. I placed the box on my dining table and lifted the lid. The faint smell of old paper mixed with ink filled the air. My fingers brushed against envelopes yellowed by time. I began laying them out one by one across the table until it looked like a courtroom exhibit. The first pile was tuition, $42,000. Every semester's payment, every textbook allowance, every check I wrote while I worked late nights correcting essays. I remembered the exhaustion in my bones, but also the pride I felt believing education was the ladder that would lift my daughter into a better life. The second pile was the down payment, $150,000 for the house she lives in now. Money that should have been my retirement cushion. I remembered standing in the bank lobby years ago, signing my name with a mixture of pride and fear, telling myself this is what mothers do. The third pile was mortgage support, $16,000 every year to cover payments when Evan lost his job, or when Melissa called me crying, claiming she was at risk of losing the home. I remembered the way my chest tightened every time I drained my account to rescue theirs. 3 piles, 3 numbers, but behind each was blood, sweat, and years of my life. As I stared at the papers, a wave of nausea hit me. My sacrifices had not been invisible, they were right here in black and white. But in Melissa's eyes, they no longer counted. Or worse, they were expected. I paused and leaned back in my chair, asking myself the questions that refused to leave me alone. Do parents have the right to keep score of what they've given? Society tells us that love should be unconditional. But does unconditional mean unending? If I write down every dollar, does that make me bitter? Or does it simply make me honest? When does sacrifice stop being love and start being duty? I had blurred the line for so long that I no longer knew. Every time Melissa needed something, I reached for my checkbook as if it were a reflex. Somewhere along the way, my sacrifice became expected, not appreciated. Do children have the right to treat their parents as interest-free banks? Was that not what I had become, a revolving door of financial rescue? Every withdrawal came with promises of gratitude, yet those promises evaporated like smoke. When does help become exploitation? I thought about the times I had been guilt-tripped. Mom, you don't want us to be homeless, do you? Or Mom, if you loved me, you'd help. Those weren't requests. They were ultimatums disguised as pleas. Should parents ever ask for what they've given back? This was the hardest question of all. Some would say no, once given, always gone. But others, especially those who had lived through betrayal, might say yes. I did not want Melissa to repay the money. What I wanted was acknowledgement, respect, a simple thank you. I sat in silence, letting the questions settle around me like heavy stones. Then I turned back to the table. I gathered the receipts, slowly stacking them with deliberate care. Each piece of paper was not just money. It was a fragment of my life. Nights without sleep, summers without vacations. Health I had ignored so I could work one more shift. As my hands touched the paper, I felt a mix of pain and power. These documents were proof that I was not crazy. Proof that my memory was intact. Proof that love had been poured into this family, measured down to the last dollar. I placed the stack neatly back into the wooden box. Then I reached for a marker and wrote 2 words on a label, "My Truth." It was a small act, but it felt like a seed planted deep inside me. A seed of empowerment. I held the box against my chest and closed my eyes. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a different future. a life where I was not a bank account in human form, a life where I chose how to spend my time and money, a life where I could read books again, take walks without guilt, maybe even travel. Healing did not come in thunderclaps. It came in whispers, in the simple act of naming my truth, in the weight of the box pressed against my heart. But as soon as I placed the box back in the closet, doubt crept in again. Would people call me selfish? Would my community judge me for cutting ties with my only daughter? Would my grandchildren grow up believing I abandoned them? I knew society's answer. Mothers don't give up. Mothers endure. Yet deep inside, I also knew that endurance without boundaries was not love. It was slow destruction. I sat at the edge of my bed staring at the floorboards. My soul felt split in two, one half screaming to protect my child, no matter the cost, the other half begging me to finally protect myself. That night, I whispered aloud into the empty room, "If love cost me my life, then it isn't love." I did not yet know the storm that was coming. I did not yet know Melissa would fight back with venom, or that she would attempt to strip me of my sanity in the eyes of the law. But I knew this. I had taken the first step toward reclaiming myself. And once that step was taken, there was no going back. The next morning, I woke with a sense of purpose that felt like a small private revolution. I dressed slowly, methodically, no dramatic flourish. Just the gray coat, the sensible shoes, the scarf my sister sent me for my last birthday. I rehearsed nothing. I had no speech. I had only the tiny ledger of truth in the wooden box and a decision that no one else could make for me. The bank was half an hour away. The city smelled like wet pavement and distant diesel. I kept my hands on the steering wheel so that they would not betray me. I breathed in then out like the slow count of a prayer. At the entrance, a glass door sighed as I pushed it open. The warmth inside felt almost obscene after the chill outside. People moved with their small, ordinary concerns. Children clutched balloons. An older couple argued softly over a brochure. My life had become something far bigger than any of their small worries. At the teller's window, I placed my ID and the small stack of papers from the box. The young woman behind the counter scanned them without comment, then looked up at me with an expression I could not read. I asked to close the joint account. She asked for signatures. My pen hovered above the line. My hand shook just enough to be noticeable. I signed. The ink bled slightly into the paper, a small imperfection that felt honest. "Is there anything else I can do for you today, ma'am?" she asked, her voice soft. "No," I said. "That will be all." My voice was flat, but inside a quiet current of relief flowed, as if I had loosened a knot that had tightened for decades. The printer whirred. A thin slip of paper fed out carrying a small official confirmation. The amount was there in black type, $20,000. Joint account closed. Confirmation number printed. My name beside it. For a heartbeat, I did not know whether to laugh or cry. That printed slip felt like an exhalation of everything I had been holding. Was I committing an act of cruelty or an act of self-preservation, people would ask. I had rehearsed the question in my own head until the edges of it grew dull. The line between revenge and survival felt perilously thin. If I pulled the funding, would Melissa call it retaliation, or would she perhaps finally understand the cost of dependence? There is an idea in our communities that mothers never stop giving. It is spoken like a commandment. You give, you forget, and you die smiling. But is the last act of smiling compulsory? Or can a mother decide once in her life to stop being the endless source of bailouts? If I walked away now, would I be selfish? Or would I finally set the precedent that elders are not invisible? ATMs. At the teller's desk, the young banker handed me the printed receipt. My fingers closed over it. The paper was warm from the machine, and the letters were black and uncompromising. I slid the slip into my wallet and felt something shift. A strange lightness settled in my chest. It was not the absence of sorrow. It was the birth of freedom. On my way out, I paused by the lobby window and looked at my reflection. The woman looking back had the same face I remembered from a dozen birthdays. But there was a new line in her eyes, an edge like someone who had been pushed long enough and finally pushed back. I whispered to myself the words crisp and private. This time it's for me. Driving home, I thought of controversy and comfort in equal measure. Was it fair to cut funding right before her birthday? Some would call it calculated cruelty. Others would call it poetic justice. There are those who believe that timing matters more than motive. The calendar, they say, can make an action either cruel or righteous. I could hear those tongues wagging already. How could she, they would say. On your child's birthday. But timing had always been part of the language of boundaries. If the birthday highlighted the absence of gratitude, then perhaps it was the right moment to unmask the truth. Should elders keep financial control until their last day, I had tried to relinquish certain things over the years. Small things, then bigger. But when the money I had saved for the evenings of my life was used as a cushion for others, I felt my autonomy erode. Was it a parent's duty to continue supplying the nest long after the chicks could fly? Or does dignity demand that we preserve our own safety? I also thought about the children, my grandchildren. Should they have been told? Could I have spoken to them first? Would that have softened the blow or only muddied their love with politics? We tell children fairy tales about family and fidelity. But do we also teach them the rules of adults about consent and boundaries? The question gnawed at me: was it my place to spare them the knowledge, or to let them see that grown people sometimes choose themselves? The controversy would swirl, I knew, but the act itself was deceptively simple. Paper-printed signature given, confirmation number logged. Small administrative things, bureaucratic noises that any bank could testify to. The real work would come later, not in forms, but in the empty spaces left behind in phone calls unanswered, in the desperate messages. I stopped at a small coffee shop on the way back. I bought a cup and held it between my palms as if it were a talisman. The steam warmed my fingers. I tasted bitterness and strength. Across from me, a man in a suit scrolled through his phone. A mother with a stroller smiled at her child. The world moved on. I sipped slowly. Each swallow felt like a small act of reclamation. Back at the apartment, I took the receipt from my wallet and sat at the kitchen table. The wooden box sat on the shelf where I had left it the night before. I opened it and placed the new slip on top of the pages labeled Tuition Down Payment Mortgage Support. It was a thin paper, but its presence rearranged the whole arrangement. I closed the box, and then, as if performing a ritual, I slid it back into the closet and locked it. The key I placed in a small wooden bowl on the hallway table. A small private thing. Healing arrived in small measures. The first was the printed confirmation itself. It was a mechanical noise, but it sounded like permission. The second was my whisper at the lobby window. This time, it's for me. Saying it aloud felt like an oath. The third was the act of tucking the receipt into the My Truth box. That was both a claim and a promise. I had documented the cost of loving. I had made a record that would not be erased by denial or anger. When evening came, I did not sleep. But the anxiety that had gnawed me before felt different. It did not dissolve. It shifted toward a strange steadiness. I had severed one form of dependence. The world would respond. People would judge. Melissa would rage. There would be consequences I could not yet see. But for the first time in years, I had exercised an agency that was mine alone. As I turned out the light, I thought of my sister's advice from long ago. She had told me simply, "You can be gentle and be firm." Tonight I had tried both in my very small way. Tomorrow would begin whatever came next. I did not know if I would be called cruel or courageous. The label mattered less than the fact that I had at last chosen myself. The night stretched long, but I refused to let exhaustion win. At my dining table beneath the dim light of a single lamp, I began the letter. 23 pages in total, each filled with lines of blue ink, written slowly by my trembling hand. The pen scratched softly against the paper, every stroke of ink carrying the weight of a life spent giving. I did not write like an accountant. I wrote like a mother. Numbers and emotions were braided together, inseparable. Tuition $42,000, I wrote, and every late night at my desk correcting essays with tired eyes, so you could dream without debt. Next page, down payment, $150,000. Given not to buy walls and a roof, but to build a promise that you would never fear eviction. Page after page the list grew, but beside each dollar figure, I wrote my memory of love, of sacrifice, of the years shaved off my own life, to buy comfort for hers. When I paused, I held up the first 10 pages. My handwriting wavered sometimes, slanting right, sometimes shaking. Still the ink was steady enough to be read. The truth had a pulse. The paper smelled faintly of iron and effort. But then the questions came. They pressed against me like wind against a fragile window. Was this letter truth, or was it humiliation? If Melissa ever read it, Would she see my words as evidence of love or as a public indictment? Would she say I had turned my home into a courtroom with her cast as the accused? Did documenting the truth make me cruel? Could children bear the naked truth of sacrifice? I remembered being young when my own mother hinted at the hours she worked for me. I had flinched, too ashamed to face the weight of her giving. Perhaps Melissa would do the same, shield her eyes, call me dramatic, dismiss the words as manipulation. Was it fair to hand her the raw ledger of my soul? Should family matters be carved in ink at all? Some say paper makes things permanent. Others say silence preserves peace. By writing this letter, I risked crossing a line. Society rarely forgives making the private public, even if the audience was only her eyes. Would she ever forgive me for setting down her sins in words that could not be erased? Was this love, or was it a sentence? A letter 23 pages long might look less like affection and more like judgment. What would the neighbors think if they saw it? Would they whisper that Eleanor Whitmore had turned motherhood into a trial brief? Would Melissa call it an execution dressed as concern? Is a mother wrong to love and scold at the same time? That was the sharpest blade of all. To say I love you and you hurt me in the same breath is a paradox society rarely tolerates. We prefer clean categories, the saintly mother or the bitter one. But real mothers, human mothers, live in the contradiction. By page 15, tears had stained the margins. I pressed on writing as though my life depended on it. Each new line felt like peeling off another layer of silence that had smothered me for decades. I remembered the first time Melissa asked for money with a shaking voice. I remembered the later times when her tone hardened, when expectation replaced gratitude. I remembered the moment she said the best gift would be if you just died. I wrote those words down too, not to wound her but to anchor the truth. Somewhere in those hours I stopped writing for her and started writing for myself. The act of putting ink on paper gave me a kind of liberation the bank receipt alone could not. This was not just about dollars. It was about identity. It was about reclaiming the narrative of my life from the silence of shame. At page 21, my hand cramped. I shook it out, rubbed my knuckles, then pressed forward. The pen scratched and scratched until the final page lay beneath my palm. I took a breath and wrote the last sentence with care, steadying the ink so there would be no doubt, no distortion. I loved you through every dollar. When the words were finished, I set down the pen. The silence in the room was immense. The air seemed heavier, but my chest felt lighter. The lamp glowed faintly against the blue ink, making the words shimmer as though they were breathing. I gathered the pages together, smoothed them, and slid them into a large envelope. On the front, I wrote only her name, Melissa. No titles, no terms of endearment, just her name. Then I sat back, holding the envelope in my lap, and allowed myself to feel. The healing came in layers. First, the act of writing itself, the liberation of pouring out truth without interruption. Then the tenderness of the last line, the reminder that even through pain, my love was real. And finally, the weight of the envelope in my hands, a physical object that proved I had not imagined my sacrifices. Proof that I had lived them. Proof that I had survived them. Was I ready for her reaction? No. I knew the storm was coming. She might scream, might tear the pages apart, might deny every line. But denial would not erase ink. Denial could not rip truth from paper. I placed the envelope on the corner of the table beside the cake box that was still unopened, frosting roses untouched. They looked absurd together, sugar and ink, sweetness and indictment. I almost laughed at the absurdity. But then I whispered, "This is my gift, the only gift I have left to give." And with that, I turned off the lamp, leaving the envelope waiting in the shadows for the day Melissa would open it. The letter had been left on the table, and I knew it would not sit quietly. Words once written have a way of moving like wildfire. A week later, the consequences arrived, not in whispers, but in the sharp knock of a stranger at my door. It was late afternoon. The sky over Oregon was gray, threatening rain. I had just poured myself a cup of chamomile tea when the knock came. 3 heavy raps, official in tone. I opened the door and found a man in a suit standing there, his expression flat, his hand holding a white envelope. "Are you Eleanor Whitmore?" he asked. "Yes," I answered, steady. He placed the envelope into my hand. "You've been served." The door closed behind me with a hollow sound. I stood in my living room, fingers tightening on the thick paper. The envelope bore the mark of the county court. My name was typed neatly across the front. I broke the seal, unfolded the packet, and felt the weight of every line. Melissa had hired an attorney. She had filed a petition to declare me unfit, claiming cognitive decline dementia in legal terms and seeking control of my finances. The words blurred for a moment, but I forced myself to read them again slowly. Petition for guardianship, allegations of incapacity, supporting affidavits. My daughter's name signed boldly beneath the accusations. Questions rose not just in my mind, but in the mind of any mother watching. Do children, when parents age, instinctively look for ways to strip them of authority? Is it natural fear or calculated greed? What happens when love is replaced with strategy and family becomes a battlefield of signatures and statutes? Was accusing me of dementia a form of protection, or was it betrayal in its sharpest form? Some would argue Melissa was concerned about her mother's judgment. Others would call it elder abuse in plain daylight. To place false infirmity on a living, breathing parent, is that care or cruelty? Does the American legal system carry hidden cracks that make room for elder abuse? Guardianship laws meant to protect can also become weapons. How many other mothers have sat at kitchen tables like mine, staring at documents designed to silence them, while courts nod at children's petitions? Are aging parents always at a disadvantage? Society paints the elderly as fragile, slow, forgetful. But fragility does not equal incompetence. To be 72 does not mean to be voiceless. Yet when my name was placed next to the word incapacitated, the assumption was clear: old age equals weakness. Should parents ever respond by suing their children? The thought itself feels unnatural, almost grotesque. To take the child you carried into a courtroom to expose the rot in public view. Would that be justice or the final collapse of family bonds? I set the papers down on my table. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. My chamomile tea sat beside the packet steam, still rising in delicate swirls. For a long moment, I simply looked at the two objects, the tea and the summons, as if they belonged to the same picture. One spoke of peace, the other of war. I reached for the cup first. I took a sip, tasting calm in the middle of chaos. Then I lifted the summons and placed it gently beside the saucer. My hands did not tremble. My breathing was steady. I knew Melissa believed this would frighten me, rattle me into submission. But instead of panic, a curious quiet spread inside me. It was as though the storm had announced itself with thunder, and I had already found my shelter. I whispered aloud, not to anyone in particular, but to myself. The truth has ink. Ink does not fade. The irony was not lost on me. She accused me of losing my memory, of drifting into confusion when I had a 23-page letter, every line a testament to clarity. The receipts in the wooden box, the bank confirmation, the deliberate handwriting. My truth was catalogued and sealed. I picked up the packet again and studied the legal phrasing. Alleged incapacity, best interest of the ward. The words were cold, clinical, devoid of the warmth of human history. They reduced me to a case file, a name in bold type, as if a lifetime of sacrifice could be rewritten by the stroke of a lawyer's pen. But my spirit refused to shrink into those margins. Later that evening, I sat on the porch with my cup refilled, watching the first drops of rain darken the wood. My neighbor, Mrs. Harlow, waved as she passed with her dog. She did not know about the envelope inside. To her, I was just Eleanor, the woman who tended roses and baked pies for the church fair. And that was the mirror I needed, a reminder that I was more than the accusations printed on white paper. I thought of reflective questions that every viewer might carry into their own lives. If your child tried to erase your autonomy, how would you respond? Would you bow quietly? Or would you find a way to remind the world that you are still here, still competent, still worthy of respect? The rain picked up, but I stayed seated, letting it patter against the roof. Storms come and go. What mattered was the foundation, the ground beneath. Healing came subtle but unmistakable. First, in my refusal to collapse, in my ability to sip chamomile while holding a summons. Second, in the recognition that I was not powerless, that truth inked and documented carried its own defense. Third, in the quiet smile that crept across my lips as I imagined the courtroom where Melissa believed she would triumph. The law could summon me, the papers could accuse me, but my soul had already decided I would not be erased. I placed the packet into the wooden box beside the receipts and the letter, closed the lid, marked it again with the words I had written days earlier, my truth. Then I turned out the light, leaving the storm outside to rage as it wished. Inside, I had already chosen calm. The courtroom battle had not yet begun. But the first skirmish was fought in a sterile office with white walls and no curtains. I sat in a chair across from a doctor whose nameplate read Dr. Moore Clinical Neuropsychology. His glasses were thin-rimmed, his expression careful. He spoke in measured tones the way people do when they are trying not to show judgment. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "we need to perform a cognitive assessment today. It's routine in cases like yours." I nodded. Routine for them, perhaps. For me, it was a quiet humiliation. To keep my own money to hold on to the life I had built, I had to prove that my mind was still mine. He slid a piece of paper across the table. "I'd like you to draw a clock. Put all the numbers in, then set the hands to 10 past 11. My hand hesitated only a second before I picked up the pencil. I drew a circle. Inside, I placed the numbers 1 through 12 evenly spaced. Then I drew the hands short for the hour, long for the minute. When I handed it back, the doctor studied it longer than necessary. My heart beat against my ribs as though my sanity depended on the angle of 2 drawn lines. Next came 5 words. He read them slowly: apple, table, penny, window, horse. I repeated them aloud, storing them carefully like pearls in a box. Then he asked me to write a sentence. Any sentence at all. I took the pencil again and wrote, "I have always known my own name." My hand was steady, my letters neat. Minutes later, he asked me to recall the words. I spoke them back: apple, table, penny, window, horse. My voice was clear, unwavering. Dr. Moore made notes in silence. The scratching of his pen was the only sound in the room. I sat upright, refusing to let my shoulders slump. I was not here as a patient. I was here as a witness to my own competence. The question spun inside me sharper than any test. Is it fair that the elderly must prove their sanity just to keep their own property? At 72, I had lived through wars of history, civil rights battles, the raising of a child. Yet one shaky line on a clock face could undo me. Did youth ever need to prove its clarity before signing checks? Or was this demand reserved for gray hair and wrinkled hands? Does a child have the right to doubt her mother's mind? Doubt is natural. Suspicion can be venom. Melissa's petition wasn't born of love, it was born of entitlement. Her right to question me was not the same as her right to claim me incapable. Where is the line between concern and conquest? Is medicine being exploited for theft, disguised as care? The clinic, the clipboard, the sterile walls? These tools could heal, but in the wrong hands, they became weapons. Doctors could be turned into instruments of erasure, their notes twisted into keys that unlocked someone else's vault. How many times had this system been used not to protect, but to plunder? In America, is elder abuse truly taken seriously? We speak about it in whispers, in brochures left on clinic tables. But in courtrooms, the scales often tilt toward the young. Accusations against children rarely make headlines. And mothers ashamed or silenced often surrender without a fight. Does aging always mean weakness? Wrinkles are not proof of incompetence. A slower gait is not proof of confusion. Yet society ties fragility and futility together with cruel rope. And here I was forced to slice that rope with a pencil and 5 recalled words. Dr. Moore finished his notes and looked up at me. His face betrayed nothing at first, then softened slightly. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "your results are consistent with full cognitive function. In my professional opinion, your mental health is intact." The words fell like a gavel. Intact. Not diminished, not questionable. Intact. He signed the evaluation, tore off the top sheet, and handed it to me. The paper felt heavier than its weight. Black letters on white background stamped with the authority of medicine. I folded it once carefully and slid it into my purse. On the drive home, the tension began to release, though not fully. The test was passed, but the war had not ended. Melissa would not stop here. She would twist, maneuver, find new angles. But for now, I had a shield. Back in my kitchen, I brewed another cup of chamomile tea. The steam rose, curling like fragile threads of hope. I sat at the table where the wooden box rested. Beside it, the envelopes and receipts, the 23-page letter. I reached into my purse and pulled out the evaluation. I placed it next to the cup, letting the edges curl slightly from the steam. I stared at the words, letting them sink deeper into me. Mental health intact. It was not just a medical conclusion. It was a reclaiming of my voice. It was a rebuke to the lie Melissa had tried to tattoo on my name. I picked up the page, held it close, and whispered, "My mind is still mine." The healing came not as thunder, but as a quiet certainty. For years, Melissa had tried to define me provider-caretaker burden, now supposedly incompetent. But this page reminded me that no one, not even a child, could rewrite my soul. I slipped the certificate into the wooden box with the rest, closed the lid, touched the label, My Truth. Then I took a sip of tea, the warmth steadying me. Outside, rain tapped against the glass. Inside, I was whole. It was well past midnight when the sound of my computer chimed, a soft ping that startled me in the silence of my kitchen. The rain outside had slowed to a drizzle, the kind that whispers against glass, as though urging me to pay attention. I almost ignored it. At 72, I had no reason to check messages at that hour. But something pulled me to the screen. The subject line read, I'm sorry. The sender, Evan, my son-in-law. The timestamp, 2:14 a.m. I opened it with the kind of dread one feels when turning a key in a door you're not sure you want to enter. His words spilled out, typed hastily, sentences fractured by guilt. Eleanor, I don't know how to begin. I should have spoken sooner. Melissa told me not to get involved. She said it was between you and her. But I've watched too long. I've watched her twist your love, turn it into leverage. I've watched her smear your name with lies about dementia. I said nothing. And that silence makes me guilty. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, she threatened me too. Said if I sided with you, she'd cut me out of the mortgage, the accounts, everything. I didn't have the courage to stand up to her, but you need to know you're not crazy. You never were. She planned this. And I let it happen. I sat back staring at the glow of the monitor. My hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the collision of fury and relief. The email was a confession, yes, but also an indictment of the rot inside my own family. Was a man who relied financially on his wife to be blamed or pitied? Evan had no stable income of his own. The house, the accounts, even his credit cards were under Melissa's name. Society often laughs at such men, calls them weak-kept. But dependency is a cage, and cages breed complicity. Did that make him less of a man, or merely more of a prisoner? Can a late confession ever be forgiven? At 2 a.m, he found the courage to whisper truth into my inbox. But where was this courage when Melissa filed petitions? When she called me unfit? When strangers delivered summons to my door, did remorse have value when it arrived? Only after the damage was done. Does silence in the face of injustice make one an accomplice or a victim? He claimed fear of losing security, fear of Melissa's wrath. Yet by standing aside, he let lies calcify. His silence made her accusations louder. Is fear an excuse? Or is it cowardice in polished shoes? What is a husband's role in a family war like this? Stand with his wife or with the truth? Marriage vows say for better or worse, but do they include enabling harm to a mother-in-law? Evan chose his wife over justice, but in doing so, he betrayed both. Should loyalty be blind, or should it be bound to what is right? Does society accept a man who lives off his wife's wealth? Perhaps if roles were reversed, people would call it sacrifice. But with Evan, the whispers were harsher. He eats from her hand. The world scorns dependency in men, yet seldom questions the dynamics of power when women depend. Why is one pitied, the other ridiculed? I read the email twice, then 3 times, letting each sentence carve its weight into me. My breath caught at the line, "You're not crazy. You never were." That line mattered more than all the rest. Because Melissa had tried to brand me as unstable, to tattoo confusion across my forehead. And here was Evan, the man living under her roof, admitting it was fabrication. His confession was both dagger and balm. I printed the email. The whir of the printer felt almost ceremonial. Each line etched in ink, time-stamped forever. Evidence, but not just evidence, validation. I carried the warm sheet to my wooden box, lifted the lid. Inside lay my letter, the receipts, the medical evaluation. Now Evan's confession joined them. Another piece of the mosaic called My Truth. I whispered as I slid it in, not proof that I'm sane, proof that I was never alone in seeing the lies. Later that morning, I sat at the window, tea steaming in my cup. The sky was pale gray, the kind of color that erases shadows. I thought about Evan's position, trapped between loyalty and conscience. His silence had wounded me, yet his admissions soothed me in ways I hadn't expected. Healing does not always come from the hands we hope for. Sometimes it arrives clumsily at 2:14 a.m., typed by fingers shaking in shame. The email did not erase the pain Melissa had caused. nor did it absolve Evan's silence. But it gave me something Melissa could not steal: affirmation that my mind was intact, that her lies were not truth, and that someone else had seen what she tried to hide. I closed my eyes and remembered my mother's words from long ago. Even when people betray you, their cracks let light through. Evan's confession was one such crack. Through it, light spilled, not enough to rebuild the whole house, but enough to guide me through the dark hallway. I folded my hands around the cup of tea, letting the warmth seep into my palms. "My mind is still mine," I whispered again. But this time it carried a softer echo. Because now, with that email resting in my box, I had one more voice, however belated, standing beside me. The sound of the gavel cracked through the chamber like thunder. "All rise." My knees stiffened as I pushed myself up, spine straight, chin high. The courtroom smelled faintly of wood polish and recycled air. The walls were lined with shelves of leather-bound codes. This was not a family dining table where disputes could be hushed or softened. This was the arena of law where every word was inked into record. In front of me on the clerk's desk lay a thick folder stamped foreclosure, $460,000. The numbers glared at me in bold print, as if money could weigh more than blood. Next to it, I spotted a packet of papers, my letter, my receipts. And at the very top, the email from Evan, printed in black ink, time-stamped 2:14 a.m. subject line, frozen as "I'm sorry." Melissa sat at the opposing table. Her hair was perfectly set, her jacket a shade too sharp for the occasion. She looked more like a woman arriving at a business meeting than a daughter defending herself. When her eyes met mine, there was no warmth, only calculation. Her attorney rose first, voice clipped and confident. "Your Honor, my client has filed credible claims that her mother, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, is suffering from diminished mental capacity. We present foreclosure records, erratic financial withdrawals, and her refusal to follow sound medical advice as evidence." I clenched my hands on the wooden railing before me. Erratic. Every dollar had a paper trail, every payment bore my signature. Yet here my choices were being painted as symptoms of decline. As the arguments rolled on, I felt the weight of deeper questions pressing in. Does family justice truly require a courtroom? Once upon a time, disputes were solved in kitchens, over tea, through apologies and compromises. But here I was, a mother hauled into court by her own child, forced to defend her sanity to strangers in black robes. Is that what family has become, a place where love needs a legal stamp? Should elder abuse trials be broadcast, live-streamed for the world? Part of me thought, yes, let people see what happens in these sterile rooms. Let them hear the voices of parents stripped bare by greedy children. Yet part of me dreaded the spectacle, my private pain turned into evening entertainment. My dignity chipped away one click at a time. Should the law intervene so deeply in families, I understood the law's duty. But sometimes it felt like a blade cutting bonds instead of mending them. Could statutes really measure love? Could precedent dictate loyalty? At what point did intervention become intrusion? Was Melissa to be pitied or condemned? Some whispered she was overworked, pressured by bills, cornered by the demands of modern life. Stress could twist anyone, but stress is not an excuse for betrayal. Was she a victim of her own desperation, or simply a woman who mistook cruelty for survival? And what of airing private disputes in public? Was it protection or humiliation? By standing here, I protected myself. Yet by standing here, I also revealed scars to neighbors, colleagues, even strangers. Did I save my dignity or sacrifice it for the sake of proof? My attorney rose. His voice was steady, but he did not need theatrics. He held up Evan's email. "Your Honor, here is written evidence, a confession by the son-in-law, time-stamped and voluntarily sent. He acknowledges that these claims of dementia were fabricated, designed to control Mrs. Whitmore's finances. He admits complicity through silence. This, coupled with Mrs. Whitmore's clean medical evaluation, dismantles the petition entirely." The judge adjusted his glasses, scanning the email slowly. Each word seemed to hang in the air, echoing louder than any argument. Melissa's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Melissa herself paled, lips pressed so tightly they blanched white. The clerk placed the foreclosure file before the bench. The judge tapped his pen. $460,000, he said aloud. That is not just a number. That is a life's worth of sacrifice. A mother's savings, her home, her dignity. And you ask me to erase it on the grounds of unproven decline. He set the file aside firmly. I watched Melissa's mask slip. For a flicker, I saw not the confident businesswoman, but the child I once held, now trapped by the mess of her own making. But pity was fleeting. Choices have consequences. The judge raised the gavel. The room held its breath. This case, he declared, is dismissed. The gavel came down with a final ringing crack. The sound reverberated through my bones. I did not cheer, did not smile triumphantly. Instead, I released a breath I had carried for months. My shoulders sank as though a heavy yoke had been lifted. I felt lighter not because I had defeated Melissa, but because the truth had been carved into the record. No one could take that away now. Healing in that moment was not dramatic. It was quiet. It was the simple relief of being heard, of having my sanity affirmed not by whispers, but by a court of law. I gathered my papers, slipped the printed email back into my folder. I would return it to the wooden box at home, where it would join the other fragments of my story. My truth. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of Evan in the gallery. He didn't meet my eyes, but I saw the tension in his shoulders, the silent apology hanging heavy. For once, that was enough. Walking out of the courthouse, the autumn air hit me fresh and cool. I closed my eyes, tilting my face upward. The world outside was no different than it had been that morning. But within me, something had shifted. The battle was not the end of Melissa's resentment, nor the end of wounds in my heart. But the law had given me a verdict. A dismissal, yes, but more than that, a restoration. And as I stepped down the courthouse stairs, I whispered to myself, barely louder than the breeze, I am free of this weight. The tape stretched across the front door was bright yellow, stamped with the county seal. A thick white sheet fluttered in the autumn wind foreclosure notice. My eyes traced the bold type, the numbers, the signatures that made it official. My house, once my fortress, now bore the scarlet letter of financial erasure. I stood on the porch with my keys dangling uselessly in my hand. The locks were changed. A sticker warned, "Do not enter without authorization." For 72 years, I had believed a home was where your family gathered, where birthdays were celebrated, where walls absorbed laughter. Now it was a frozen property reduced to legal terms and digits. I didn't cry. I thought I might. But instead there was an odd calmness, a hollow quiet that settled in my chest. The silence was not emptiness, it was space. Still questions gnawed at me as they would gnaw at anyone in my shoes. Should I have let the house go just to keep my dignity? Some would say no, fight for every brick, claw against the system, wrestle the law until you reclaim your place. But sometimes dignity means walking away before the fight consumes you. Sometimes silence is not surrender, but preservation. Between parents and children, who holds the greater right to property? I worked for decades, scrimping, saving, bending my back over long hours so Melissa could stand tall. This house was mine, every dollar earned, every corner painted with my sweat. Yet she had tried to stake her claim by law, as though inheritance could be demanded early. Do children have the right to seize what parents built, or does creation belong to the Creator until their last breath? Do grandchildren have the right to choose sides? Melissa believed she could control the narrative, feed them only her version of the story. But children see more than adults admit. Their eyes catch the tremors, the silences, the truths unspoken. Do they owe loyalty to their parents' version, or do they hold the freedom to embrace their grandmother's? Should I sever ties with my daughter completely? The thought clung to me like a thorn. Was Melissa lost forever, or was she still my child, trapped in her own blindness? Could cutting ties heal me, or would it amputate something I could never regrow? Family is both root and chain. To break it might mean freedom, but it might also mean exile. Was walking away in silence weakness or strength? Some would see me turning from the house empty-handed as defeat. But strength is not always measured in possessions clutched. Sometimes it's measured in what you refuse to let define you. I touched the notice gently, feeling the crispness of the paper. My name was on it, not Melissa's. My loss was recorded, but also my choice. The wind caught the edges of the sheet, snapping it against the door. I turned away. My steps on the porch echoed oddly, as though the house itself was saying goodbye. I walked down the cracked pathway to the street, carrying nothing but a small box under my arm, the wooden one labeled My Truth. Inside it were receipts, letters, the medical certificate, and Evan's confession. They had tried to strip me, but here in this box, I carried everything that mattered. When I reached the mailbox at the end of the driveway, I noticed a small envelope tucked inside. No postage, just my name in uneven handwriting. My heart skipped. I tore it open with trembling fingers. Inside, scrawled in blue crayon, were 5 words: "Grandma, we love you." Below, in pencil, shaky letters from another hand: "Don't believe what Mommy says. We know you're kind. We miss you." The paper smelled faintly of glue and childhood innocence sealed in ink. My knees gave way. I sat right there on the curb, the cool concrete pressing through my skirt. And then the tears came, not heavy sobs of despair, but light freeing drops that blurred the crayon words into watercolor halos. In that moment, healing did not roar. It whispered. It whispered through crayons and pencil lines, through the bravery of children daring to reach out. I pressed the letter to my chest. The foreclosure notice might define me on paper, but this note defined me in love. Melissa could manipulate banks, twist lawyers, summon courts, but she could not touch the bond that skipped a generation and landed in my lap, handwritten in uneven strokes. I placed the letter carefully into my wooden box. Another piece of truth, but this one softer. Evidence not of battle, but of love that endured, despite walls, despite lies. Walking away from the house, I felt the strangest sensation, freedom with weight. Freedom because I was no longer bound to fight for a place that had become battlefield. Weight because family ties do not dissolve with a judge's words. The silence around me was profound. No shouting, no lawyers, no gavel, no accusations. Just silence. And in that silence, I realized, was freedom. I whispered to myself, to the autumn air, sometimes losing the house means finding yourself. The bakery smelled of butter and sugar, warm and familiar. I stood before the glass case, rows of cakes gleaming under soft light. My eyes landed on a small chocolate one, modest in size, with swirls of frosting that looked like they had been piped by a hand rather than a machine. 8-inch, the clerk said, sliding it onto the counter. "Just 1 candle," I replied. She rang it up. $12. I pulled out cash, crisp bills I had folded carefully in my wallet. It struck me once I had paid $42,000 for tuition, $150,000 for a down payment, $16,000 for mortgage installments. Now $12 was enough to honor myself. I carried the cake in a brown paper box back to my rented apartment, a modest 1-bedroom with linoleum floors and a single window that looked out over the parking lot. It was not grand. It was not the house with the porch and the garden, but it was mine and mine alone. I set the cake on the small wooden table, placed the candle upright, lit the wick. The flame flickered, dancing against the dim walls. The room was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Yet inside that silence, questions arose. Questions society loves to debate, but seldom answers. Is old age spent alone, loneliness, or freedom? Some would pity me, imagining evenings of silence, empty chairs, no voices to fill the air. But in solitude I found release. No shouting matches, no accusations, no endless requests for money. Loneliness is when your soul is unheard. Freedom is when you hear it again. Is family defined by blood or by anyone who chooses to love you? Melissa was my blood, my daughter, my lineage. Yet blood had not spared me from betrayal. Family, I realized, is less about DNA and more about loyalty, kindness, and truth. Sometimes those who carry no shared genes become the truest kin. Is forgiveness the same as healing, or is letting go? Enough people often say, forgive to move on. But forgiveness is not always possible. Some wounds resist absolution. Healing for me meant laying down the weight even if forgiveness never came. To let go was not to excuse, it was to refuse to carry her chains any longer. Can one build a new family beyond kinship? In the smiles of neighbors, in the kindness of strangers, in the letters of grandchildren slipping through cracks of silence, I found possibility. Family is not inherited. It can be chosen, cultivated, welcomed. Should a mother ever abandon an ungrateful child, society insists motherhood is eternal, unconditional. But unconditional love should not mean unconditional abuse. Walking away was not abandonment. It was survival. I stared at the candle's glow, small yet steady. My breath hovered. A knock startled me. 3 gentle taps on the door. I opened it to find Nora, my neighbor from down the hall, holding a casserole dish wrapped in foil. "I thought you might not want to eat alone tonight," she said softly. I felt tears sting my eyes. Not because of pity, but because of presence. Someone thought of me. Someone cared without expectation, without debt. "Come in," I whispered, voice catching. "But first let me finish this." I turned back to the cake, leaned forward, closed my eyes. She asked me to die, I whispered into the quiet flame. Instead, I chose to live. Then I blew the candle out. The smoke curled upward, faint and sweet, a symbol not of endings, but of release. Later, Nora and I ate together at my small table. Her laughter filled the room, light and unforced. For the first time in a long while, I felt warmth that did not sting. Healing, I realized, is not a grand finale. It is a candle lit for yourself, a neighbor's knock, a child's crayon letter, a breath released after years of holding it in. I had lost a house. I had lost illusions about blood ties. But I had found something truer myself. Still standing, still sane, still alive. The silence in my apartment no longer felt heavy. It felt like freedom. And as I washed the plates, I thought to myself, this is not the end of my story. This is the beginning of living on my own terms. Her story does not end with loss. It ends with choice. Eleanor walked away from betrayal, from foreclosure, from the heavy silence of a courtroom. And in walking away, she discovered something no law, no signature, no daughter could take: her dignity. She was told her greatest gift would be to die. Instead, she lit a candle and chose to live. This story is not only about one woman. It is about every parent who has been taken for granted, every elder who has been told they are less, every heart that has been silenced. Eleanor's journey reminds us it's never too late to reclaim your truth. Now I want to ask you, have you ever felt unappreciated by the very people you sacrifice for? If you were in Eleanor's shoes, would you forgive or would you walk away? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. If this story touched you, please give it a like. Subscribe and join our growing community of voices who believe in dignity, justice, and healing. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder your worth does not depend on who recognizes it. Together, we are building more than a channel. We are building a global family, one story at a time. Thank you for listening, and remember, sometimes losing everything is how you finally find yourself.